Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2023 Association of Wake Forest University Black Alumni and the Program in African American Studies Homecoming Lecture. My name is Corey D.B. Walker. I'm Dean of the School of Divinity here at Wake Forest University, the Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities, and inaugural Director of the Program in African American Studies. On behalf of our intellectual community, we are delighted to welcome all Wake alumni to this event, which marks our third annual homecoming lecture and celebration. We're really excited to have this year's conversation on the theme, the War on Black Studies, Education, Politics, and the Fate of Democracy. We're also excited to have each of you join us for this conversation, which promises to enlighten, inspire, and most importantly, enable us and empower us to really deepen the democratic experience in our world today. I'm glad to be joined by our distinguished panelists, but we're also joined by the president of AWFUBA, Keenan Mann. Keenan is a Delaware native, father of Cadence, and a 2004 graduate of Wake Forest University, where he majored in English, minored in sociology, and in American ethnic studies. His program manager for Reach Out and Read, and for years has a deep experience in higher education administration and nonprofit management. He has already served one full term as chair of social media of AWFUBA after years of mentoring, and he's currently in his second year as president of AWFUBA. Let's welcome Keenan Mann, who will offer us a few words of welcome on behalf of the Association of Wake Forest University Black Alumni. Keenan?
Thank you so much, Dr. Walker. I really appreciate that wonderful introduction. Now I have to live up to all of that greatness. No, just kidding. But I'm really appreciate you all for joining us. As Dr. Walker said, I'm the president of AWFUBA, the Association of Wake Forest University Black Alumni, and we are elated to be here with you all, the community, with African American Studies for what is the third year. I remember the inception of this that started as an idea, and it's great to see it to come to where it is right now, to have other former alumni on the panel as well today, and so many great thinkers, philosophers, and educators on this webinar. Many thank yous to the Black alumni, to alumni at large who are a part of this, and everyone else from our community who will join in this conversation. We know that this is a catalyst to many other conversations that will be had during homecoming and thereafter, and we just welcome you all to be a part of this and other endeavors that we collaborate with. As a former educator and in the classroom teacher, these conversations are so vital for us to continue to have. And in my work with literacy, I really appreciate having a collective conversation about all of these things. So thank you so much to you all. And again, welcome.
Thank you so much, Keenan. And your words really remind us of the importance of these conversations, not only for their educational value, but really for deepening our democratic experience and deepening and connecting those bonds between us as citizens and as humans. This past summer, on the pages of the New York Review of Books, true long-distance runner in the struggle for Black freedom, and the distinguished scholar, Robin D.G. Kelley, published his bracing essay, The Long War on Black Studies. That essay opens up with these words: "It would be a mistake to think of the critical wave of attacks on critical race theory as a culture war. This is a political battle." What Kelley highlights is the meaning of this particular moment and its longer history in the role in the production and reproduction of critical knowledges about Africans and persons of African descent across space and time, and particularly in the United States. He also begins to engage the question of the values of education in our moment and the ways in which universities have become targets for extreme vitriol in our public conversations. Most importantly, Kelley underwrites the crisis in American democracy that we're experiencing in our moment. And oftentimes, this crisis is concealed under the language of a culture war. And highlighting the long war on Black studies, Kelly draws our attention to the ways in which issues around African American history, issues around Black studies in high schools, and issues around the ways in which we understand the plurality and multiplicity of human being and belonging in the world is under attack in our contemporary moment. Today, I'm delighted to welcome an alum of Wake Forest University and a distinguished scholar in his own right, along with two of our newest members of the Wake Forest faculty, who will join us for a conversation on the war on Black studies, education, politics, and the fate of democracy. Our first guest is Darius Boast. Many of you already may know Darius. Darius is a 2004 graduate of Wake Forest University and a 2005 graduate of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences here at Wake Forest. Darius is currently Associate Professor of Black Studies and Gender and Women's Studies and the co-principal investigator of the Provost Initiative on the Racialized Body at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Darius is the co-editor of Frontiers, a journal of women's studies. He's the author of, not the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, the University of Illinois at Chicago. I apologize for that. He is also the author of the award-winning book, Evidence of Being, The Black Gay Cultural Renaissance and the Politics of Violence, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2019. He has published widely on such topics as HIV/AIDS, Black queer theory, literature, visual culture, Black masculinities, and trauma and violence. His research has been supported by the Hutchins Center for African American and African Research at Harvard University, the Eccles Center for American Studies at the British Library, and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, among others. He's currently working on two different book projects, one an interdisciplinary study of queer visual cultures from the Black Atlantic from the 1970s to the present, and a Black queer history of the United States, co-authored by C. Riley Snorton, entitled For the Revisioning History series at Beacon Press. Thank you, Darius, for joining us. Also joining us are two newest members of the faculty at Wake Forest University and newest members of the faculty in African American Studies. Claire Crawford is Assistant Professor in the Program of African American Studies and the Department of Politics and International Affairs here at Wake Forest University. She received her PhD from the University of Southern California, and her research focuses on expanding our understanding of democratic engagement and democratic futures through her study of power and freedom in the political lives of Black folk. She is currently working on her book proposal based on her dissertation project, Hum, So the Devil Doesn't Hear You, Southern Black Rural Political Existences in the In-Between. She's also working on, which is an interdisciplinary study that attempts to deeply understand how we can consider otherwise possibilities of democratic engagement as practiced in the murmurs, the breaks of speech, and the hums of Black Southern rural life. Daniel Henry is Assistant Teaching Professor in the program in African American Studies and the program for Leadership and Character at Wake Forest University. He received his PhD at the University of Virginia in political theory, where he was also recently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Politics. Underlying both his teaching and his research is a focus on the ways African American intellectuals, artists, and social movements have sought to rethink the practical, moral, and conceptual bases of politics in democracy's absence. His work has been published in the journals Theory and Event and American Political Thought. Welcome, Daniel, and welcome, Claire. Let's begin with Darius. Darius, how do you enter into this conversation around the war on Black studies?
Yeah, I enter as a scholar in Black queer studies and a scholar in Black feminist studies, and both of which have been targeted for in the revision of the AP African American Studies curriculum. I was in the early parts involved in that process, but dropped out. And I was also in conversation with one of the leaders of the AP board after I read the curriculum, and it only had two queer people listed, and really didn't speak about their roles in it. And I've really been trying to sort of think through what it means for this sort of revision of the curriculum. It was not necessarily taken out, but it was put into the sort of supplementary work that you could sort of elect through, to pay for, to include in the curriculum in your teaching. And for me, I think that, what's significant about that is that feels like Black queer studies, Black feminist studies are not just sort of additive models. In fact, they have been trying to critique additive models, and sort of questioning what it means to put these fields in the periphery, given this kind of state of emergency that Black, queer, and trans people are in terms of facing discrimination and violence, and being targets in our kind of right turn in politics. So I think that I'll stop there for now. But yeah, I can continue the conversation in terms of thinking about, for me, both the kind of marginalization in this curriculum, but what the kind of marginalization of these fields in Black studies writ large means.
Thank you so much, Darius. Darius underscores the question of the marginalization of these important areas of knowledge production and reproduction in Black queer studies and in Black feminist studies in the recently revised AP curriculum for African American studies that's available for high school students. He also underscores that in this particular moment, a moment of emergency where we're seeing heightened levels of violence against the Black LGBTQ community, not only in our public lives, but also in our intellectual spaces. What does that speak? How does that speak to our moment of democratic crisis? Claire, how do you begin to think about this moment of this long war on Black studies, as Professor Robin D.G. Kelly reminds us of?
The space from which I enter, I often say right now, as I'm sitting with my work, is from the pew of the mass meetings of the civil rights movement, thinking about the murmurs and mumbles that it took for rural Southern Black folks to become political beings, to choose that pathway to becoming political, to, depending on the day, connecting that to the couch in the trap houses in these like urban rural spaces as well, where folks are trying to make sense of the possibilities or the limited possibilities of being labeled as dispossessed and working with what they have to survive. And so when I start to think about particularly this democratic crisis and coming from Black political thought, the question always comes, are you ready for us to be free as Black folks? Like, are you ready for our freedom? And that Black political thinkers across time have been trying to come up with an assessment to this. Like, we are assessing the state's readiness. Are you really ready to see what we have, what we can give, right? And calling upon the everyday folks who figured out how to exist in between that.
Well, Claire, you really appropriately highlight those undercurrents of, I love the way you put it, the becoming political of Black people in these critical moments, those moments of the Black freedom movement in the US. But the ways in which Black people have always been free and their spaces of self-determination, of agency, and of full freedom that affirms their worth, value, and dignity. Daniel, this long war on Black studies moves from questions around the marginalization of fields like Black trans studies, Black queer studies, Black feminist studies in our AP exam, to the ways in which there's always become or always being a becoming political of Black folk. How do you enter this conversation on the war on Black studies?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think in some ways I'm going to echo what Claire said. You know, my own work concerns democracy in Black political thought and Black politics during in spaces and eras when democracy is denied. You know, what does democracy mean for Black intellectuals and movements who are denied membership in We the People? But also how have Black thinkers reconsidered the meaning of democracy itself during these periods and reenacted it or created it anew? And I think in some ways, the attack on Black studies, the war on Black studies, the long war on Black studies really is of a piece with this broader history. That there's a kind of salience to the history that I'm sort of thinking about here in the contemporary denial of We the People that's represented, I think, in the attack on Black studies, but also in the response of Black scholars and communities to that attack as well. People who are challenging efforts of politicians and others to try to mold the public sphere, mold our public conversations into a kind of white consensus.
What does democracy mean now in light of this long history of democratic malaise or democratic neglect? Thank you so much, Daniel. Darius, I want to come back to you because you placed an issue on the table that's been a study in your award-winning book, The Black Gay Cultural Renaissance and the Politics of Violence. When you begin to think through, when you offered us a way of thinking and framing this moment of not only epistemic marginalization and erasure of Black queer studies and Black feminist studies in the AP exam and in Black studies, but you also connect it to these regimes of violence that are being revisited anew and in an increased intensity in our moment on Black bodies, Black queer bodies, Black trans bodies, Black bodies in general. How do we begin to understand this longer arc informed by your award-winning work?
Sorry, I'm reminded of scholar Roderick Ferguson, who's one of the folks who was called out in the curriculum or in the curriculum revision. And one of the things that he talks about is that, you know, the fear, this is really a kind of minor target, critical race theory, the attack on that in certain ways is a minor target in terms of the grand scheme of knowledge, the way that DeSantis is trying to sort of focus on this one course. And part of the problem that Ferguson points out is that it's not just about Black studies, but it's about and sort of the movements that were at the foundation of Black studies, but it's all the subsequent movements that came out of Black studies. And part of the fear of Black studies is what will emerge from these courses and who, what kind of bodies will be produced as a result of Black studies that may sort of lead movements or participate in movements for a more just world. And I think that is part of the question that we have to think about, that this war, that's not a culture war, but a real political battle in certain ways is about policing forms of embodiment, forms of knowledge production that comes from embodiment that could sort of critique the limits of our democracy, critique that have a vision beyond the now that does not sort of sustain or Black, queer, and trans life. So for me, what is at stake in this attack is the possibility, a possibility of something new and other than what is.
Thanks so much, Darius. Claire, Darius underscores what's at stake in this attack. It's not only about the production and reproduction of certain forms of knowledge, but it's also about the production and reproduction of certain types of citizens and certain types of subjects. And those subjects that then begin to expand the imagination of possibilities in the world. Can you speak to us a bit about your work, re-examining the Black freedom movement and the ways in which those subjects expand the horizons of possibility in the ways in which you begin to investigate those interstitial spaces, the murmurs, the hums, and the ways in which those formal political spaces connect with the everyday vernacular of Black life?
Definitely. So just filling and building off of what Darius is saying, when we start to think about possibility, I use the concept of otherwiseness from Sean Crawley to think about a politic of existing that's based in both dreaming, surviving, and just like non-normative life. And I think particularly if we go back to some of the more dispossessed and crucial folks as well are these Black folks who are existing in rural spaces. And that is where I tend to focus on my work, who have then both practiced upon the type of dispossession and the crime and the violence of the American state from the beginning, so that they've been consistently trying to figure out how to survive coming off of the plantation, maintaining in these southern spaces where access, where ideas of citizenship are even less involved beyond who do you work for, how can I get paid, like who do I owe to my housing? This is where we get into concepts of like different versions, slavery by another name, and this ongoing conversation in that capacity. Where I'm trying to intervene is ask the question of the civil rights movement does not end or begin with legal passage, right? So we can't begin the conversation with King had a dream and we got the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, one that does dishonor to his legacy, but then also to the thousands of people who were involved in making this true and who chose this aspect. One of the things that I became interested in is the sonic realities and life of rural Black folks. And there we find that they begin to murmur from the plantation. They begin to speak to each other in illegible ways in order to make sense of existences. And the politics of that, as some scholars have picked up on, might call it a hidden transcript in the public, or thinking about it as this like the in-between, like this liminal space that's happening right in front of us. But I think it's even deeper than that when we really look at the words of the people who were there on the pews, the people who were actually marching, the people who were singing, and they tell us, I chose to become political this day, right? I went to jail, and even though that was a life sentence, I decided that I could live from this. This was my political breaking moment. I saw freedom in the air from this moment. And so these realities and these imaginations and these dreams stayed with them beyond the 60s. And so their freedom being formed beyond this capacity. And so I think possibility and also listening is an undervalued political value, and particularly listening for things that don't necessarily match up with quote unquote clear English production. And that is where we find Black folks speaking to one another and beyond the capacity of what democracy is willing to listen to. They are singing democracy, just not signing it.
They're singing democracy, but just not silently and in ways in which we can't always decipher if we're just looking at those formal public transcripts of public life. But the ways in which individuals are beginning to really articulate a radically alternative democratic imaginary. Thanks so much, Claire. Daniel, you've heard Darius really frame this issue around a series of critical interrogations, not only his award-winning work, but also the work of Yale University's Roderick Ferguson. Claire underscores the work of Robin D.G. Kelley and the ways in which he makes use of James Scott's notion of hidden transcripts, really central to the ways in which she's developing a political virtue or political ethic of listening, as well as the ways in which we have these conceptual revolutions, such as the dispossessed, Daniel Ben Said's formulation of revising Marx's early notions of the dispossessed, or the ways in which Fanon operationalizes the wretched, these particular formations. You work in the long arc of this African-American intellectual tradition. Speak to us a bit about how your work on African-American intellectuals and the ways in which you're mining their thought and their work for notions and ideas of deep democracy can help us in this moment of democratic crisis.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, there's a kind of opposition both to the kind of content of Black studies and I'm speaking in the very kind of long, you know, historical sense of Black studies, even before the establishment of the first departments. There's an opposition to the kind of content of Black studies, as well as kind of an opposition to Black voice, you know, of who gets to enter the public sphere. And I think that both of those are kind of important in this moment, as well as kind of in the history I consider. You know, I think it's sort of revealed in you know, in Florida, the attack on both CRT as well as on the AP African American Studies course comes at the same time as they're also proposing and indeed implementing, you know, quote unquote classical studies education. You know, I mean, the politicians probably aren't familiar in a deep way with either one of these traditions. So what do they think that they're doing, right? And, you know, there's a politics of resentment in which they think that any kind of space devoted to Black voice is a kind of loss on the part of white citizens. And so the question, to some extent, in this longer history becomes like, how do you speak in such a moment, right? How do you speak in such a context? What is political voice? What's the meaning of your political voice in front of a hostile audience, or in front of those who refuse to listen, or those who understand your voice as not legitimate in the first place, right? And so for me, it means paying attention to the way that people have created, or I should say, have tried to kind of reshape public life, reshape public space, reshape public sphere in ways that are more empowering, and that simultaneously kind of find forms of self-determination, but also, when possible, you know, of course, shift the terms of public discussion.
Thanks so much, Daniel. I want to pick up on that theme that you just articulated of reshaping public life and the public sphere in our particular moment, and really hone in on that, hone in really on the idea of the university in our moment, in this moment of the 21st century. And I want to begin with Darius. Darius, you're running a major initiative, Provost Initiative, on the racialized body. How do we begin to think about the uses of the university in our moment to really articulate these broader visions of what Black studies can be, and these broader visions of what American democracy can be?
Yeah, I think for us, you know, I'm just starting in this position, and so I'm still, you know, trying to figure out where this particular program fits in. But I think that one of the ways that we are trying to do this work is to sort of widen the breadth of what we consider knowledge production. And you know, one scholar, Catherine McKittrick, has talked about the way that anti-colonial thinking comes through reading across a diversity of texts. And so one of the things that we're doing, you know, is trying to engage artists, trying to engage activists, as well as doing traditional talks, doing sort of inviting people to do private tours at galleries, those kinds of things, to sort of think about the various ways that knowledge is being produced, and, you know, to say and to value as I've talked a lot about in my own work, community-based forms of knowledge. I think, though, part of the issue is that the neoliberal, university, in the sense of, like, for us, we have a majority minority campus. We're a Hispanic serving institution, and we are, grossly underfunded by the University of Illinois system. And to me, right, we also produce most of the workers in Chicagoland. And so to me, there's a kind of disconnect in terms of the disinvestment from the state and from the university system in the work that we are trying to do. And so part of the engagement and the flourishing, or the way to sort of provide outlets for knowledge to flourish, is through critiques of the university system and the way that they are disinvesting from these sort of potential forms of knowledge production.
Darius, you really underscored an issue that we here at Wake Forest, we held a Mellon conference about a year ago, and we welcomed our dear friend Devarius Baldwin, and that conference was on the universities and the neighborhood. And it really underscored the relationship not only of Wake Forest to Winston-Salem, but the relationship of universities and that knowledge production to to surrounding communities and to broader society. And turning to Claire, I want you to begin to engage. What does it mean to begin to look at these alternative sites of knowledge production that you're investigating? What would be the implications that you're seeing for a university to come, and even for a democracy to come? Coming out of that long tradition of Black studies, we see so many alternative institutions that were flourishing in the 60s and 70s. The Institute of the Black World, right here in North Carolina, Malcolm X Liberation University. What would the university look like if we understood and translated and heard those mummers, those spaces in between?
I think that's a really big question, but I can start to imagine some of the possibilities of it. I think that's what I'm trying to do in the classroom as well, right? So in my Black Southern Organizing and Sound class, getting the students to first think of listening to their everyday. They're keeping sound journals as this way of experiencing the world as a weekly thing, and kind of embracing that this is a learning community, right? So one of the biggest things that I think we learn, particularly from how Black folks come to the political, is that Black political gatherings looked a number of ways, right? So we have the hush harbors, if we want to go back to these spaces. And they also included a number of other things in that spaces. So it's not just a place for grievances, it's not just a space for politics, it's not just a space for the spiritual, right? They come into these spaces whole. And so one of the things I'm always thinking about is there space, and how do we imagine a democracy where we can all enter whole, and that there's not this split, right? So we don't have to call what Kathy Cohen calls boundaries and boundary breaking. And that's explained even more in Richard Aiden's work about being a boundary breaker. Where do we go to make sure that Black politics doesn't remain queer to this understanding of the American political sphere, but really much so of it, right? It's here. You're clearly responding to Black people. That is not an unclear thing. And it's been that way from its creation, 1789. And I think you can't just go Constitution, but you also got to go Fugitive Slave Acts as being a part of that. And so thinking about you are responding to us. You see us, you see what we're doing. And so how do we integrate some of these things? I think one of the things that's in my mind now is how do we create listening as a part of not just an institutional, but just this human practice? And obviously, I think one of the biggest things that has an impact when we start to think about movement work, freedom is an endless meeting, right? As the book title goes. And so understanding that this is a thing that we have to put into practice, right? Democracy should be a practice in a very Foucaultian way. The state is not a thing, right? It's something that we practice, it's something that we give power to. So I always want to say, like, how do we turn these institutional spaces back to the people making them? How do we get to the people to build and believe in something? And I'm always pushing, like, hey, what if something was different, right? The American democracy is somebody else's dream, which means we could dream of something new.
Of course, Robin D.G. Kelley, once again, in those Freedom Dreams, that iconic book that celebrates its 20th anniversary in our particular moment, is one that really mines this, as well as it is in conversation with your work. And interestingly enough, Claire, you bring up the classroom as this critical site in the university, as this site of producing and interrogating those possibilities. And I want to I want to turn to Daniel and begin to think. Daniel, you teach an Introduction to African American Studies course. That seems to be an opportunity to really open and expand these horizons in new and imaginative ways. How does that become a particular site in increasing democratic flourishing in our particular moment?
That's really helpful. Thank you. And I just realized my mic was on the entire time, so I hope you couldn't hear me typing away notes to Claire's response, which I thought was really helpful. So, I mean, I think that part of the really one of the really important things that an intro class does in African American Studies is revamp students or reconsider students' understanding of what it means to study. And the relationship between education in the university and the world outside of the university's boundaries, right? Helping students understand that the university is part of that broader world, and that a lot of, I mean, politically and otherwise, a lot of the things that go on in that world are replicated within the university. But also, Black Studies departments, for example, can be and are indeed a link to communities outside of the university. There are presence of those communities within the university, in fact. And it can also mean that you know, the sort of typical you know, forms that study comes or arrives in various disciplines that students might also be taking classes in can be questioned and interrogated, right? What it means to study can be interrogated in different ways. And oftentimes ways that are in conversation with other kinds of traditions of expression and community self-determination outside the university's bounds. So I think that all of those things are really important emphases of an intro class. You know, I was thinking when Claire was talking, she mentioned you mentioned Richard Eiton, Claire, and I was thinking about Richard Eiton's note that, you know, a lot of the really foundational or really important philosophical work and intellectual work done in African American political thought in the United States has been in the aesthetic domain, right? So in any case, these are just a few, I guess, responses I guess I would have to that question.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And you really underscore how those introductory courses are critical sites that connect students not only to the production of ideas in the academy and the production of other disciplinary ideas, but also to providing critical frames for linking the university and community in significant and consequential ways. It's not just an introductory to a disciplinary formation. In many ways, it's an introduction to those practices of deep democracy and what Robin Kelley does call deep study. Those practices of study that then can lead to transformative political practices. I know this conversation can go on throughout not only today, but into the long future, and it should, and it rightfully does. So I want to open up this opportunity for some of our audience members to, I want to invite them to ask questions. You can use your Q&A button right at the bottom on this webinar. You can submit your question and we'll have some, see if we have time to get to as many as possible. And as we continue this conversation, I want to once again move to Darius to begin to look at what are some of the implications of this particular moment for intellectual life and the work that you do. And how can this be a moment, if it's a moment of challenge and complexity, how does it open up and reveal these moments of slippage and opportunity to begin to rethink how we live in the world, and then how we begin to engage the world with our with Black studies and other modalities of thinking?
Is this a open question? I can respond. I think that one of the things that I keep thinking about, that I was thinking about during the shelter in place portion of COVID, is my work on folks who were Black gay writers in the early era of AIDS. And, you know, one of the things that I think they've taught me that is relevant for this moment is that catastrophe can be an occasion for sort of rigorous forms of knowledge production and also creative forms of living. And I think we could take a lesson from them about how to do our work in this moment, but also to reevaluate the stakes of our work. Do we see the knowledge that we produce as being political? And especially for the kinds of work that that are coming from disciplines that are rooted in social justice movements.
Thank you so much, Darius. Claire, where do you find that those spaces of inspiration? Darius underscores during the height of the global pandemic, when we were alone, it moved into a moment of reconsideration of this extensive archive of Black gay writing and Black gay writers and how they dealt with these moments of catastrophe. Where do you find sources of hope and inspiration in this moment of democratic deficit?
I tend to turn back to the works of Black women who were writing across all these different time periods, particularly right now interested in Reconstruction and the types of life, because that was a really interesting in-between moment, right? For like, democracy doesn't necessarily exist in America in the ways, and people refer to that time period as the second founding. And so I even think about the work of Anna Julia Cooper and Ida B. Wells, or even Maria Stewart beforehand, as they were writing about the possibilities of what we could do to live, right? And I think that's a huge part of it, that sometimes we can't really, is not possible yet within the space of the institution of like, how do we consider life and this like living as a part of, as a democratic act, right? As it's not just survival, but like, how do we get to living as this democracy? And so I find myself turning to that. And then just to piggyback off of what Dan was saying about this aesthetic, right? Like, so I listen to a lot of music. Lately, I've been listening to a lot of mass meeting clips in the archives and thinking about how folks decided in those moments of the humming of the prayer meeting that this is where like I want to be, this is who I want to be, this is how I'm going to form my democratic being, and that being so crucial. So like going to these other spaces and kind of finding hope in that, and like how people are naming liberation in ways that we might not recognize as a politic because it seems so far away from it, but this is how they were making sense of freedom and self then to live.
Daniel, Claire underscores these rich practices of democracy that really, and democratic possibility, that really open up the imagination and spaces of opportunity and spaces of hope, and most importantly, spaces and experiences of joy. In these challenging moments, how do you begin to wrestle with the possibilities of intellectual life as a Black Studies scholar? And then where do you find those moments of joy in your work?
Thank you. You know, I think that one of the things that I think has always, even before I kind of knew very much about Black Studies, I think that one of the things that always attracted me to Black Studies scholarship was the way that so much of the work is or represents a kind of creative rejection of the given, right? A creative rejection of the way that science, the society is ordered, its dominant myths and understandings. Creative in the sense that it's not just critique, although that's a really important practice, but also that that these scholars are drawing on traditions that you know, we can that we can kind of recenter our understanding upon, as well as new kinds of understandings and imagination. And I always return to Du Bois's remark in his 1926 address, Criteria of Negro Art, where he says that, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, you know, that he's remarking on his Black audience's visions of what the world could be if it were really a beautiful world, right? A world in which you know, beauty, truth, and goodness held sway. And you know, what he kind of indicates in that essay, or in that speech, I should say, is that this means rethinking what each of those means. And I find that a really, really powerful, exciting possibility, and one that I guess I feel like I can always return to. You know, I can always return to that that practice, that possibility.
Well, I know each of you are continuing to advance the frontiers of knowledge, but doing so in a manner that's very committed and dedicated to really deepening our understanding of what it means to be human and deepening those democratic possibilities in our world today. I want to thank you each for joining us, and I want to give you an opportunity to sum up, have some summary remarks for our audience as we prepare to close down this conversation, put a pin in it, only to pick it up and continue into the long future. And I want to begin with Darius, then move to Claire, and then we'll end with Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, I think the brief thing that I will say is that, you know, this is being framed as a war on Black studies. I think we're winning. I think that we have to assert, you know, that we are winning and we will win. And, you know, I find spaces of joy in seeing all the forms of creative scholarship that's coming out, that we are still in these spaces of intellectual community and producing liberatory thought. So I think that, you know, the focus needs to be, someone mentioned Sean Crowley's work, the sort of alternative modes of being that already exist in those forms of knowledge, and to celebrate those, and to sort of affirm the work that we are already doing. That the policing of knowledge that it's coming from this war is a withering of their own humanity, not ours.
Thank you so much, Darius. Claire?
Yes, I would say the call, in the spirit of call and response, and this like lingering Africanism, the call has consistently always been put out, and again, returning to the response from American democracy has always been one of fear, this fear and freedom being intimately intertied and placed upon Black people has never been, though, our response to American democracy. We have reframed ideas and concepts of what it means to be a citizen. We have pushed American democracy forward. This hasn't been something done, obviously, without harm and spectacular violence. However, there's this living moment that we find in what scholars are recognizing as the hum of the world, this eternal hum, this thing that we can all tap into as a life force and moving forward. So really pushing towards, don't get stuck in what you see on the headline, but return back to your spaces and you speak. And when someone talks to you, you hear them say, well, and you hear them say amen, and you hear them hum with you, like, know that it is soothing, that we are at peace with each other, and we can keep it moving forward that way.
Thank you so much, Claire. And Daniel.
Thank you. I guess I sort of return to the fact that Black studies, for me at least, and for others, even though not all Black studies have the same orientation toward or same ideas about democracy, democratic thought, that Black studies is a democratic force. And so the backlash on Black studies is part of a broader backlash on democracy, but so too is the movement for democracy. I think also ought also to entail a kind of movement for Black studies, and is indeed informed deeply by Black studies. I think that recent social movements for democratic rights have been enriched by that, and often pretty publicly so, publicly informed by Black studies scholarship. And so I do find some hope in that.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And Darius, yes, we are winning. And that's a wonderful way to put a point in this conversation. And I want to thank each of you for your very considered remarks. And thank you, most importantly, for your significant scholarship and significant teaching in Black studies. I know that with you as professors, both at University of Illinois, Chicago, and definitely here at Wake Forest, we're delighted to have you and continuing to contribute. And I want to close a bit on a moment of opportunity. It's an opportunity to continue to support the program in African American Studies here at Wake Forest University. We have over 30 faculty members who contribute to the program in African American Studies that we started a little less than 3 years ago. We've welcomed wonderful scholars such as Claire and Daniel. We have a new scholar who will join us next year. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Virginia, Esher Shirley, who received her PhD from the University of Michigan. And of course, as you saw last year, we were so delighted to welcome our senior scholar here, Shana Green Benjamin, who delivered last year's AWFUBA AAS homecoming lecture. So with that, I want to share with you an opportunity to continue to support the program. We have the Dolly McPherson Fund for African American Studies. And everyone at Wake Forest knows the late Dolly A. McPherson. She came to the university first with, of course, the iconic Maya Angelou in the 1970s. And then she joined the faculty as the first full-time African-American woman faculty member at Wake Forest. And she's the author of Order Out of Chaos, the autobiographical works of Maya Angelou. And this fund supports the overall development of African American studies, including the creation of new and innovative courses, supporting faculty research and collaboration, both within Wake Forest and with other universities, and support a variety of programs that really critically address some of the critical issues of public concern. You can go right on our African American Studies website and support African American Studies through the Dolly McPherson Fund. And we want to thank you for supporting this, the third annual AWFUBA AAS Homecoming Lecture. And as we close out, I want to close with some of the words of Robin Kelly's essay, and where he writes, despite the claims of well-intentioned and sympathetic pundits, Black Studies courses are not designed just for Black students alone, but for all students. The point is not to raise self-esteem or make students feel guilty, nor is Black Studies merely a diversity project. Black Studies sits at the margins of social inquiry, but it stands at the very center. And as we face a rising tide of deep authoritarianism, we must remember how we got here: by protest, by occupation, by rebellion, and by deep study. And I would also like to add, by deep practices of joy and community. Thank you so much for joining us for this year's AWFUBA AAS Homecoming Lecture. We look forward to seeing each of you as you return back to the Reynolda campus this year. And for all the reunion classes, those classes of 3 and 8, we look forward to celebrating with you. And we want to thank you for joining us. Follow us on our website, afam.wfu.edu, and on our Twitter feed at WFU AFAM Studies, and continue to join us for all of our programming here on campus or via Zoom webinar. Thank you so much. My name is Corey Walker, and I wish each of you a happy homecoming. Go Deeks!